The courtroom exploded into laughter. Not the judge's laughter. Not the deputies. The developer's lawyers. Sitting in the front row, laughing at a 68-year-old man in a faded church suit. A man who hadn't said a single word in his own defense. Judge Eleanor Briggs slammed her gavel down. $500,000, she said. Payable within 90 days. Or the county takes the farm. Marcus Carter didn't flinch. He didn't argue. He just nodded. Once. Slow. Like a man who'd been told bad news his whole life and learned there was no use fighting. The messenger. The deputies stepped forward to walk him out. That's when the doors at the back of the courtroom opened. Not quietly. Both doors. At once. Cold air rushed in first. Then boots. Hard, fast, deliberate. Every head turned. Governor Elijah Cross walked down the center aisle in a suit that cost more than the fine the judge had just handed down, flanked by two state troopers who looked like they didn't know why they were there either. He wasn't looking at the judge. He wasn't looking at the lawyers. His eyes were locked on the old man, standing between two deputies, wrists half raised out. Of habit, waiting for cuffs that hadn't come yet. The governor didn't stop at the rail. He walked straight through it, past security, past the bailiff who didn't even try to stop him, and wrapped both arms around Marcus Carter, like he was afraid the man might disappear if he let go. Dad, he said, voice cracking. I've been looking everywhere for you. Silence. The kind of silence that has weight. The kind that presses down on a room until somebody has to break it. Judge Briggs opened her mouth. Nothing came out. Nobody in that courtroom knew Marcus Carter had a son. Nobody knew the son was the governor of the state. And nobody, not the judge, not the lawyers, not the deputies still holding an empty pair of handcuffs, had any idea that in the next 30 minutes, everything they thought they understood about this case and about the quiet man in the church suit was about to fall apart. To understand why the governor of this state was on his knees in a county courtroom, hugging a farmer like he was the last solid thing in the world, you have to go back 22 years, back to a gas station, back to a 9-year-old boy sitting on a curb at 11 at night. No jacket, no bag, nothing. His mother had dropped him there, told him to wait. She never came back. The boy sat on that curb for 6 hours. People walked past him, bought their gas, bought their cigarettes, didn't look twice. At 5 a.m., a pickup truck pulled in. Old, rust around the wheel wells. A man got out to fill the tank. He noticed the boy first because the boy was shivering. He noticed the boy second because the boy was trying not to let anyone see him cry. Marcus Carter had buried his wife 11 months earlier. He had no children of his own. The doctors had told them both, years before, that they never would. He wasn't looking for a son that morning. He was just a farmer who needed diesel. But he sat down on that curb, next to a boy he'd never met, and he didn't ask questions. He just said, "You hungry?" The boy nodded. That was the whole conversation. Marcus bought him a sandwich for the gas station cooler. Sat with him until the sun came up. Then he called the county, because that's what you're supposed to do. Nobody came for 3 days. So Marcus kept feeding him. The county eventually placed the boy, Elijah, in emergency foster care 2 towns over. It lasted 11 days. The foster father drank. The foster mother looked the other way. On the 12th day, Elijah ran. He ran 14 miles in the dark, in October, back to the only address he knew. A dirt road. A farmhouse with a light still on, because Marcus Carter didn't sleep well those days and never had since his wife passed. Marcus opened the door and found a boy standing there, bleeding from a fall in the ditch, saying the same 4 words over and over. "Please don't send me back." Marcus didn't send him back. He drove into town that same night and filed for emergency guardianship. A black farmer, 62 years old at the time, widowed, no formal income beyond crop yields, going up against a system that didn't usually bend for men who looked like him. It took 8 months, 2 hearings, a caseworker who fought for them, and a judge who almost didn't. But he got him. Life on that farm wasn't easy. Marcus worked sunup to sundown. Corn, soybeans, a few dozen chickens, a dead on the tractor that never seemed to shrink. But every night, no matter how tired he was, he sat at that kitchen table and helped Elijah with his homework. Every night, Elijah remembers the smell of that kitchen, coffee and diesel, and the particular quiet of a house where nobody was yelling. He remembers his first pair of new sneakers, not hand-me-downs, not thrift store, because Marcus sold two calves he couldn't afford to sell just so the boy could walk into seventh grade without holes in his shoes. He remembers Marcus never missing a single school event. Not one, even during harvest, even when missing a day in the fields meant a smaller check that winter. Marcus used to say the same thing every time Elijah apologized for costing him money. "You're not a cost, son. You're the whole reason I get up." Elijah didn't understand what that meant back then. He understood it fully now, standing in a courtroom 22 years later, watching deputies about to walk that same man out in cuffs. There was a winter when Elijah was 13 that neither of them ever talked about much. The crop had failed. A late frost, then a drought that followed it, the kind of 1-2 punch that could take a small farm under in a single season. Marcus lost almost everything that year. He sold his father's old shotgun, sold a set of tools that had been in the family 3 generations, skipped meals he told Elijah he wasn't hungry for, though Elijah figured out the truth soon enough, the way kids always do. One night, Elijah found him at the kitchen table at 2 a.m., a stack of unpaid bills in front of him, his head in his hands. Elijah stood in the doorway a long time before Marcus noticed him. "Go on back to bed, son," Marcus said, not looking up. "Are we going to lose the farm?" Marcus was quiet for a moment. "Not while I'm breathing," he said. "You go to sleep. That's not something for you to carry." He found a way. He always found a way. A second job driving a grain truck for a neighboring operation, 3 hours each night after the field work was done. So Elijah never noticed the lights in the kitchen go dark any later than usual. Elijah didn't learn about the grain truck until years later from a neighbor at a 4th of July cookout who mentioned it like it was nothing. "Your daddy near worked himself into the ground that winter," the man said. Never told folks it was because he was keeping food on the table for a boy that wasn't even his by blood. Elijah had gone quiet for the rest of that afternoon. He understood, for the first time, the real size of what had been done for him. By the time Elijah left for college, Marcus had aged 10 years and 8. His hands had gone stiff from decades of field work. His back had started to bend the way farmers backs do. He never asked Elijah for anything. Not for help with the farm. Not for money. Not for a single visit home. "You go build your life," Marcus told him. "Don't you worry about me." Elijah worried anyway. He studied law, then public service, then politics, not because he loved the spotlight, but because he'd grown up watching a good man get overlooked by every system meant to protect him, and he wanted to be inside the room when those decisions got made. He rose fast, faster than anyone expected. City council, state senate, then, for years ago, governor. Through every campaign stop, every debate, every headline, Marcus Carter stayed exactly where he'd always been, on the farm, quiet, working, never once using his connection to the governor for anything. He didn't attend the inauguration. He told Elijah the cameras would make it about him, and it wasn't supposed to be about him. "This is your moment," Marcus said. "Don't you dare hand it to me." Elijah tried, more than once, to bring Marcus into his world. A public thank you, a feature, story, anything. Marcus always said no. "I didn't raise you so you'd own me," he told his son. "I raised you because you needed raising, so the world never knew." The governor's father, as far as any reporter or opponent ever dug up, was deceased. Details private, which was technically true. His biological father had died in a car accident before Elijah was born, but nobody thought to ask about the other man, the one who mattered. Marcus liked it that way, until 8 months ago, when the phone calls started slowing down. Elijah would call the farmhouse, and it would ring and ring. When Marcus finally picked up, his voice sounded thinner, tired in a new way. "Everything's fine, son," he'd say. "Just old bones complaining." Elijah didn't believe him. But the governor's office doesn't run itself, and there was a budget, crisis, and a re-election campaign, and a dozen fires he was the only one who could put out. He told himself he'd drive down soon. He didn't know that 3 counties over a different kind of fire had already started one. aimed directly at his father. The trouble began with a man named Roland Vance. Vance owned Meridian Development Group, a company that had spent 2 years quietly buying up land around Marcus's county, waiting for the right moment to build a resort complex that would triple his money if he could just get one thing out of the way. Marcus Carter's farm sat directly in the middle of the parcel Vance needed. 40 acres that had been in the Carter family. Well, in Marcus's late wife's family for 3 generations. Marcus wouldn't sell. Vance offered, then offered more, then sent men in suits who used words like generational, opportunity, and final offer. Marcus said no every time, politely, firmly, the same way he'd said no to everything that ever tried to take something from him without asking what it would cost him to give it up. So Vance changed strategy. If Marcus wouldn't sell the land, Vance would find a way to take it. It started small. An anonymous tip to the county about unusual runoff near Marcus's irrigation ditch. An inspector Marcus had never met before showed up on a Tuesday, walked his property for 20 minutes, and left without saying much. 2 weeks later, Marcus received a letter. Violation of state environmental code. Contamination of a protected watershed. Phoenix. Pending. Court date set. Marcus read it twice at his kitchen table. Then a third time. He didn't own a lawyer's phone number. Never had needed one. He drove into town, hired the cheapest attorney he could find, a tired public defender, named Grace Whitfield, who was juggling 40 cases and had exactly 6 hours to prepare, and hoped the truth would be enough. It wasn't. In the courtroom, Vance's team came prepared with soil samples, expert witnesses' satellite, photography, and a story that painted Marcus Carter as a negligent landowner who'd been poisoning a creek for years to save money on proper waste disposal. Every piece of it was manufactured. The soil samples weren't from Marcus's land. The expert witness had been paid a consulting fee 3 times his usual rate. The satellite images had been cropped to hide the actual source of the runoff, a Meridian construction site 2 properties over. But Grace Whitfield didn't have the time, the funding, or the investigators to prove any of it. And Judge Eleanor Briggs, a woman who prided herself on running a tight courtroom and rarely questioned expert testimony, took one look at the paperwork and one look at a black farmer representing himself against a team of 6 attorneys and made up her mind faster than the evidence deserved. This court doesn't tolerate polluters, she said, regardless of how long your family's lived. Here, Marcus sat through all of it without raising his voice once. His attorney begged him to testify, to fight, to at least explain the truth about the ditch, about the neighboring construction site, about the years he'd spent maintaining that land, better than anyone else in the county. Marcus shook his head. They already decided, he said quietly. Wasting my breath won't change a mind that's made up. The second day of trial was worse than the first. Vance's lead attorney, Dale Whitmore, brought in a consultant who described Marcus's land management practices as generations behind modern standards. He said it with a smile, like he was doing the courtroom a favor by saying the quiet part out loud. A few people in the gallery laughed. Marcus's attorney, Grace Whitfield, tried to object. She was overruled twice in the same breath. Then Whitmore called a concerned local resident to the stand, a woman named Carol and Pruitt, who claimed she'd witnessed runoff from Marcus's property for years. What nobody mentioned in that courtroom was that Carol and Pruitt's son had just been hired 2 months earlier as a site foreman for Meridian Development. Grace didn't know that yet. Nobody did. But somewhere in the gallery, watching quietly, sat a woman who did. She didn't say anything. Not that day. She just watched Marcus Carter get smaller and smaller in his seat and decided, right there, that she wasn't going to stay silent much longer. By the time closing arguments came around on the 3rd day, the courtroom had turned into something closer to a public hanging than a hearing. Whitmore stood before the jury box. Even though this case had no jury, just Judge Briggs, he played to the gallery like there was one, and painted Marcus as a stubborn old man who'd let his land rot rather than sell it for a fair price. Progress doesn't wait, Whitmore said, for sentiment. Marcus's hands folded in his lap, the whole trial, tightened just slightly at that. It was the only time anyone saw him react. Grace gave her closing next. She did everything she could with what little she had. No funded experts, no investigators, 6 days to prepare against a team that had been building their case for months. It wasn't enough. Everyone in that room could feel which way the ruling was headed before Judge Briggs ever opened her mouth again. What none of them knew was that 40 miles away, a phone was ringing in the governor's office, and a staffer was about to read a name on a court filing that would change the direction of everything within the hour. What nobody in that courtroom knew was that Marcus wasn't just protecting a piece of land. He was protecting a promise he'd made to his late wife on the day she died, that no matter what happened, he'd keep this place standing for the family that would come after them. He didn't know yet that the family coming after them was about to walk through those courtroom doors in the most public way possible. The fine came down at 2:47 p.m. $500,000. More money than Marcus Carter had earned in the last 15 years combined. The judge's gavel cracked against the sound block like a verdict on a man's whole life. Vance's lawyers didn't even try to hide their smiles. One of them leaned toward his colleague and murmured something that made the other one laugh. Marcus heard it. He always heard everything. He just never let anyone see that he had. The deputies stepped toward him, and that's when the doors opened. Governor Elijah Cross had landed at the small regional airport 40 minutes earlier after a staffer flagged a court filing that had been sitting in a routine county records feed his office, monitored for land use disputes. The name on the filing had stopped him cold. Marcus Carter, $500,000. Environmental violation. 90 days to pay or forfeit the property. Elijah had tried calling the farmhouse. No answer. He'd tried Marcus's cell. Straight to voicemail. He didn't wait for a scheduled motorcade. He didn't wait for his security detail to finish there. Routing check. He got in the first car available and told the driver one thing. Get me to that courthouse. Now, he didn't know, walking through those doors, that he was 30 seconds too late to stop the ruling. He only knew he wasn't going to be one more day too late to show up. The drive from the airstrip to the courthouse should have taken 25 minutes. Elijah's driver made it in 14. Elijah sat in the back seat with his phone in his hand, redialing the farmhouse number every 90 seconds, getting nothing but silence and static each time. His chief of staff called twice. He didn't answer either time. There was a version of this moment where the governor of the state stopped what he was doing, let his staff handle it, made a call to a friendly judge instead of showing up in person, kept his hands clean the way politicians are trained to. Elijah didn't consider that version for even a second. He thought instead about a 9-year-old boy on a gas station curb and a man who hadn't needed a second to decide whether to stop his truck. If Marcus Carter could give up everything for a stranger in one night, Elijah could give up a press schedule. The car pulled up outside the courthouse just as a woman on the steps was telling a co-worker, loud enough for Elijah to hear through the open window, that they just fined some old black farmer $500,000 in there. Man didn't even put up a fight. Elijah was out of the car before it fully stopped. The embrace lasted almost a full minute. Nobody in the courtroom moved. When Elijah finally pulled back, he kept both hands on his father's shoulders, like he needed to confirm a man was really standing there. Why didn't you call me? His voice was low, but it carried in a room that had gone completely silent. Dad, why didn't you call me? Marcus's jaw tightened. His eyes were wet, but he wasn't going to let them spill. Not here. Because this isn't your fight, son, he said. You've got a whole state to run. You raised me, Elijah said. You're my state. You're the reason there is one. He turned then, slowly, and looked at Judge Briggs for the first time. She was still standing, gavel in hand, looking like a woman trying to recalculate everything. She thought she understood in the last 5 minutes. Your Honor, Elijah said, and his voice had shifted now. No longer a son's voice, but the voice that had won 3 elections. I'd like to understand the basis for a $500,000 judgment against this man. Judge Briggs found her footing fast. She'd spent 20 years on the bench. She wasn't going to be rattled by a title, even one that outranked hers. "Governor," she said carefully, "this is an active case. Environmental contamination, substantiated by expert testimony and physical evidence. I don't know what your relationship is to the defendant, but that doesn't change the facts of this matter." "Then let's look at the facts," Elijah said. "Together. Right now." He turned to the courtroom. "Where's counsel for the plaintiff?" Roland Vance's lead attorney, a sharp-suited man named Dale Whitmore, stood slowly, his earlier smugness draining out of him by the second. "Governor, this is highly irregular dash. So is a governor's father getting railroaded on manufactured evidence," Elijah said. "Humor me. What happened over the next 20 minutes would end up described in 3 different news outlets by the following morning as one of the most dramatic reversals any of the reporters present had ever witnessed in a courtroom." Elijah didn't ask the judge to rule in his father's favor. He was careful about that, careful not to abuse his office, careful not to hand Marcus a victory that could later be called political interference. Instead, he asked for something simpler: a recess, 24 hours, time for his father's counsel to bring in an independent water testing team before any judgment became final. Judge Briggs, aware now of exactly how many cameras were likely to be pointed at this courtroom by morning, granted it. But it wasn't the recess that broke the case open. It was a woman in the 3rd row who stood up before the judge had even finished speaking. "Your Honor, my name is Priya Anand. I used to work as a site engineer for Meridian Development." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Dale Whitmore shot to his feet. "Objection! This woman isn't a witness of record dash. She's about to be," Judge Briggs said, and there was something new in her voice. Not softness. "Attention. Approach, Ms. Anand." Priya Anand had been sitting in the gallery the entire trial. Not as a spectator. As someone who'd read about the case in the local paper 3 days earlier and hadn't been able to sleep since. "I left the company 5 months ago," she said, once she'd been sworn in, "after I raised concerns about runoff from our resort construction site, the one bordering Mr. Carter's property. I was told to keep quiet or lose my position. I lost it anyway for asking too many questions." She had photos, time-stamped, company emails she'd kept quietly in case anyone ever asked the right questions. The contamination in the creek hadn't come from Marcus Carter's land at all. It had come from Meridian's own site, the exact site Roland Vance was hoping to expand onto Marcus's 40 acres. The courtroom that had been so silent when the governor walked in was now a different kind of silent. The kind where you could feel the ground shifting under everyone's assumptions. Judge Briggs looked at the photos Priya Anand handed up, looked at the timestamps, looked for a long moment at Roland Vance, who had gone pale in the 2nd row. "Mr. Vance," she said, "did you have knowledge of this contamination source prior to filing this suit?" Vance's attorney tried to answer for him. Briggs cut him off. "I asked Mr. Vance." The silence stretched long enough that it became its own answer. It didn't end there, though it could have. The story didn't need more than that to break every heart in the room. But justice, when it finally arrives, tends to keep arriving in waves. Grace Whitfield, Marcus's exhausted, underfunded public defender, who had spent the entire trial watching her client absorb blow after blow without the resources to fight back, asked for the floor. She'd spent the recess making calls to the county inspector who'd first flagged the violation, to a records clerk she knew from law school. What she found was small, but it mattered. The inspection request that started this entire case hadn't come from a concerned citizen, the way the original filing claimed. It had come from an account registered to a subsidiary of Meridian Development Group. Roland Vance hadn't just manufactured evidence. He'd manufactured the entire case from the very first phone call. By the time the judge called the 2nd recess, Roland Vance's attorneys were no longer sitting near him. He sat alone at the plaintiff's table, staring at his own hands, while 2 state investigators, dispatched at the governor's request, but through entirely proper legal channels, quietly informed him he'd need to remain in the building. Marcus Carter watched all of it from his seat without a single flicker of satisfaction on his face. Elijah noticed, leaned in close. You're allowed to feel something right now, Dad. Marcus shook his head slowly. I don't feel good watching a man's life come apart, he said. Even a man who tried to take. Mean it. That, more than anything that happened so far, was the moment that made Grace. Whitfield's eyes fill up. 20 years practicing law, and she'd never watched a man refuse to enjoy his own. Vindication. Judge Eleanor Briggs took the bench one final time that afternoon, a little after 5 o'clock. The courtroom fuller now than it had been all day. Word had spread through the building, through the parking lot, through half the county by phone. She didn't rush her words. This court owes Mr. Carter an apology, she said. Not because of who walked through those doors today, because of what came out once someone finally had reason to look closely at a case I should have scrutinized harder from the start. She looked directly at Marcus. The judgment against you is vacated in full. Every dollar. The environmental violation is dismissed with prejudice, and I am referring this matter to the state's attorney for a full investigation into fraud, evidence tampering, and abuse of process. She paused. I'm also personally sorry, Mr. Carter, for the way you were treated in my courtroom today. That falls on me. Marcus nodded once. The same small nod he'd given when she sentenced him to ruin 4 hours earlier. Some habits, once a man spent a lifetime building them, don't change just because the news turns good. Roland Vance was taken into custody 2 days later, once the state's attorney's office finished reviewing Priya Anand's documents alongside the falsified inspection records. The story made every local station by that evening. National outlets picked it up by the next morning, not because a fine got overturned, but because of 4 words a governor said, with his arms around a farmer in a decades-old church suit. Dad, I've been looking everywhere for you. Reporters swarmed the courthouse steps asking Elijah for a statement. He gave them one sentence. Everything I am, I owe to the man standing next to me. That's the only headline that matters today. Then he walked his father to the car himself, opened the door for him, and drove him home. Not to the governor's mansion. Home. To the farmhouse. To the kitchen table where a 9-year-old boy once did his homework by lamplight, while a widower who owed him nothing made sure he never went hungry again. They sat there that night, just the two of them, the way they used to. Marcus made coffee out of habit, even though his hands shook more than they used to. When he poured it, you didn't have to come, Marcus said. You've got a state to run. Elijah looked at him for a long moment. You once told me I wasn't a cost. I was the reason you got up every morning. His voice caught. You're not a stop on my schedule, Dad. You're the whole reason I get up too. Marcus didn't say anything to that. He didn't need to. He just reached across the table, the way he had 1,000 times before, and put his weathered hand over his son's. In the weeks that followed, the farm didn't change much on the surface. Marcus still woke before sunrise, still walked the fence line every morning out of habit, even with the case behind him. But something else did change. Elijah came home more. Not for cameras, not for photo ops. He turned down every request from his own press office to stage a family farm visit for the campaign. He came home because his father had gotten older while he wasn't looking, and he wasn't going to make that mistake again. Grace Whitfield, the tired public defender who'd fought for Marcus with almost nothing behind her, was offered a position in the state attorney general's office 2 months later. She took it, said she wanted to spend her career making sure the next Marcus Carter never had to stand alone in a courtroom against 6 lawyers and a stacked deck. Carol and Pruitt, the concerned resident who'd testified against Marcus, was recalled by investigators once her son's employment record surfaced. She recanted her testimony, under oath, admitting she'd never actually witnessed anything. She'd only been told what to say, and paid a small sum to say it. She wasn't charged. She was, by all accounts, humiliated enough on her own. Judge Eleanor Briggs didn't leave the bench, but she changed how she ran her courtroom. Colleagues said she started asking harder questions of well-funded plaintiffs and slower, more patient ones of defendants who showed up without a team of lawyers behind them. Some said it was too little, too late. Marcus never said either way. He just told his son once that people are allowed to become better than the worst afternoon they ever had. Priya Anand, the engineer who'd risked her career to tell the truth, was hired as a lead environmental compliance officer for the state, a role Elijah's administration created, specifically because of what her courage had exposed about how easily a system could be gamed by someone with enough money. Roland Vance took a plea deal 8 months later. Fraud, evidence tampering. He lost the development company, most of his fortune, and eventually his freedom for a stretch of 18 months. He never once apologized to Marcus directly. Marcus never asked him to. Some men, Marcus told his son one evening, spend so long taking that they forget how to give anything back, even an apology. You can't force a man to be sorry. You can only make sure he doesn't get to do it again. A year to the day after that courtroom, Elijah stood at a podium at the state capitol, announcing a new fund quietly, without his father's name attached, because Marcus had asked for exactly that, to provide free legal defense to small landowners facing corporate development disputes they couldn't afford to fight alone. He called it, publicly, the Fairground Initiative. Privately, in the paperwork, nobody but his closest staff ever saw the founding document. Read differently. The Marcus Carter Fund. For every farmer who ever stood alone in a room and refused to raise his voice because he'd learned a long time ago that dignity was the one thing nobody could find him for. Marcus never did move off that farm. He still sits on the porch most evenings, the way he did the night he brought home a shivering boy who wasn't his, and made him his anyway. Some nights, the governor's convoy pulls up the same dirt road, headlights bouncing over the same ruts that have been there for 30 years. Some nights, it's just Elijah. No security, no staff, just a son coming home to sit at a kitchen table with the only father he ever needed. They don't talk about the courtroom much anymore. They don't need to, because everyone in that county, and now most of the state, already knows the story of the quiet farmer who took in a stranger's child and asked for nothing in return, and the boy who grew up to make sure the whole world finally knew his father's name. Not because Marcus Carter ever wanted the recognition, but because some debts of love are worth paying back loud, even for a man who spent his whole life paying quietly.